Hello and welcome back to the Argyle CIO Leadership Forum, Vision, Strategy, Trends. My name is Michael with Argyle. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our panel moderator. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat and we will address your questions at the end of the session. And now, without further delay, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Michael Bennett, Head of Data Governance with Bayer Crop Science. We're excited to have Michael and our panelists with us for a panel discussion titled Enterprise Architecture Roundup, Trends, Spins, and Must-Have Tools. Michael, thank you so much for being here today. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Let's start out with some quick introductions from our panel. Can we go ahead and begin? Vikas, you want to start?
Thank you, Michael. Hi, everybody. I'm Vikas Parikh. I lead enterprise architecture, finance, and sustainability IT product organization at LyondellBasell. We are a $40 billion chemical company and very global with over 100 manufacturing plants. Looking forward to the discussion.
Anyone? Kamal?
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Kamal Sayal. I'm Vice President and Chief Enterprise Architect at Eaton. Eaton is a power management company. We deal with electrical power, a lot of the electrification of vehicles and cities that's going on right now. Thanks for your time today and look forward to this discussion.
Bogdan?
Bogdan Opriya. I'm a Senior Vice President and CIO for AIC. We are an insurance carrier in the P&C space in the Mid-Atlantic area, and happy to be on this panel.
Thank you, everyone. Okay. Let's start with our first question. How can enterprise architecture be used to make a technology ecosystem more resilient? I'll open it to the panel to jump in.
I think I can go first. So I've always maintained that the strength of a chain is as much as its weakest link. So when we talk about business resiliency, when we talk about business availability and so on, it's important for us from an enterprise architecture perspective to map out what that end-to-end capability stack looks like. So what are those capabilities and what are the technologies that participate and provide that specific capability. And for each technology, the level of disaster recovery or business continuity or high availability planning that you do needs to be very consistent, so that we're managing those technologies in the exact same way. Time and time again, we're going to say, yes, our ERP is a super critical component, and we're going to make it highly available. We'll have 6 different server farms running the product, and then there's one interface that connects the ERP to an MDM system or to a finance system, and that interface was not considered to be highly available. And therefore, when that goes down, your overall kind of system end-to-end goes down. So I think as we look at the resiliency element, it's very, very important for us to be able to map out what are the different technology components that come together to enable a specific capability. And you would typically use capability maps, or you'd use business architecture models, as well as whatever service management products that you might have to be able to manage those types of things, starting from your servers to your applications to your interfaces to your APIs. And then for each of them, you have to be able to look at what their criticality is to the overall business.
Okay.
I can add to what Kamal said. I'm not going to repeat everything. I agree with everything he said. Enterprise architecture, the way I think about this is, it enables the business growth. It ensures compliance, and then it reduces complexity. And the way we think about it is, how do we standardize and simplify, right? And it has to be with a future-first mindset, right? And aligned very much to the benefits of the business goals. So what are we trying to achieve? What are the outcomes with a futuristic view in mind? And I'm not going to talk technology. I'm going to talk about, when I'm talking about futuristic goals, it's about the business goals, right? So where does the company want to go over the next 5 years, 5 to 10 years, and how does the business architecture align towards that company goals, and how do technology enable that? And that is where, if we wear that lens, there's enough technology out there now to make this resilient and make this a continuous improvement and benefit to the organization.
Yeah, I mean, I echo Kamal and Vikas here, and I would like to add one more aspect to this. The way I'm looking at this is to kind of start resiliency at the root cause, right? So as enterprise architects, we want to obviously align with the business strategies and all that stuff, but also at the end of the day, we need to put the customer at the center of our solutions, right? We need to understand the how and all the technologies around it, but also we need to keep our mind on the why. Why are we implementing this? Because that can drive different solutions, that can drive better ways to achieve some results that at the end of the day, they will translate into more resilient systems and systems that can fulfill the needs from a business perspective, right? On top of that, when I think of the architecture and resiliency, I'm thinking of ways that we can decentralize our architecture functions and implement like strong communication across the board, right? Because enterprise architecture covers a broad spectrum of things, from strategic goals of the enterprise all the way to your physical and digital infrastructure, to internal organizations and people. And I think strong communication across the board is key to develop the right solutions and develop resilient platforms for our companies and for our customers.
I think one other thing I just like to add, and back to Vikas's point as well as your Bogdan's, right? That when we look at a company, it's people, process, technology usually. A lot of times we're going to jump into the technology pieces, but I think when we talk about resiliency, and again I'm going to go back to business resiliency, there's the technology aspect of it certainly, but there's also the people and the process aspect, right? So are the businesses, and Vikas, I think to your point, as we look at the future state, where are we at in the next 3, 5, 7 years? I think there needs to be a conversation with the businesses as well that, hey, what are some of those backup processes that you have in place should something happen to technology, right? Because at the end of the day, it is technology. It is a bunch of ones and zeros, hopefully, qubits in the future, but things can go wrong. And if things do go wrong, they may be out for only 5 minutes, but if those 5 minutes are critical, what are you doing from a business process perspective to be able to accommodate, for limited disruption while the technology is out? And I think that's another element that as enterprise architects, we need to be asking those questions, because at the end of the day, the process will drive the technology and obviously the people and the data elements as well. So I just wanted to kind of add that comment in there too.
Okay.
Yeah, to your point, Kamal, besides the disaster recoveries and stuff like that, we need to think also about like cyber risk, right? How are we positioned to respond to a potential cyber attack or cyber event that can happen? So very good point there.
Great. We're going to move on to the next question. What are the most common enterprise architecture challenges, and how can IT leaders overcome them?
I can go first. I think the biggest challenge, I think about it in a couple of ways, a couple of challenges. One is having the divergence between the CIO and the business leader, on what does enterprise architecture mean and what will it bring to the table for the company. I think that's one of the biggest challenge. It's all about change management. And the second challenge, once you have that buy-in and that alignment, it's to put a balanced team together, and with a vision and futuristic view. I'll give you an example. I was brought in at Lyondell 3 years ago to put in an enterprise architecture. We did not have one, and our CIO She comes from the business. She is a Lyondell a functional focused experience employee, and she started leading IT 3 years ago. She became the CIO, and it was very refreshing for a leader from within the business coming in and trying to hire an enterprise architecture, understanding the value of what that could bring. And she quickly became the conduit of connecting the dots with her relationships when she was the business, and now running IT, saying here's why this is important, right? So I think that in my mind is a couple of biggest challenges, along with, of course, putting the right vision for the enterprise architecture organization.
I think I can jump in here. Again, Vikas, completely agree. Not going to echo executive sponsorship. Super critical. I think the other challenge I've seen a lot is within enterprise architecture, the fact that you want to be looking at the enterprise, and a lot of times the functions within the enterprise are not as connected, right? They tend to work a lot in silos, and therefore there's usually a challenge in getting all of the data together, so we can even start to figure out where are kind of opportunities of standardization from a capability perspective, or where do we have some duplication in process, right? And so that becomes a rather large challenge in terms of getting those views, because from those views you can start to determine your 1-3-5 strategic plans and horizons, and have more meaningful conversation with the businesses as well, around rationalization opportunities and so on. So that is one area I found when you look at your kind of technology or application inventories, when you look at what are your SLAs, when you look at what are your data retention requirements, all of those things, if you don't have the right data sets, if you don't have the right data stewards for those areas, enterprise architecture often is not able to provide actionable and real-time guidance for the folks to be able to do something different and move the company in the right direction. So that's another area I find is fairly challenging. It takes a while for us to get those people engaged and data sets, and then by that time people start to lose patience.
And echo Vikas and Kamal's thoughts there around the buy-in, which is super important in order to get alignment across the board. And one thing that I noticed also, it's around like cutting the red tape, so to speak, right? So we need to focus on the most essential questions, so we can cut the time required for architecture reviews, for submission, and be able to make the processes way more effective. Because if we can show that value to the company, show that value to our business counterparts, we can definitely get their buy-in and then work on the alignment between the groups and CIOs and other business leaders in the company. So I think it's very important that we align enterprise architecture with business need and try to simplify it to make it more accessible and easier to understand to our counterparts.
I think I'll add a little bit more to it, just for the audience to have some also real like examples, tools, if you will, or methodologies. I'm a big fan of the Gartner Escape model, which ESC, APE, and it's one half is inspire and the second half is engage, right? So inspire is all about coming up with the vision and having the buy-in, and then engaging. But then more importantly, there's another Gartner tool, which is the pace layering aspect of it. Now the power of pace layering is when you sit down with the business and map it out, where what at a 50,000 feet, what it is, it's identifying your systems, classifying them into system of record, system of differentiation, system of innovation, and more importantly, going down to the process level and saying which processes within the organization are important to us for our intellectual property, and everything else should be off the shelf and following industry best practice. right? Source to pay, for example, procurement, 95% of it should be following the industry best practice, versus if you have a technology business within our chemical industry, for example, that's our intellectual property, and how do we apply technology around that? So mapping that quickly gets the alignment on everybody to say what are the areas that we need to focus on, where should we invest, and where should we continue to simplify, right? And then Michael, with your background of data, if you add data to this dimension and understand the data lineage and the whole aspect of it, it would start doing wonders to the organization.
Yeah, I think that resonates at multiple disciplines, at least in my case, in terms of governance and data. Focus on what makes you unique. What value are you bringing uniquely to the marketplace, and that's where you put your investment. Everything else is kind of a commodity, and so how do you really capitalize on those commodity types of services, and really invest in the uniqueness? Any other comments on this one? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question. Okay, next question. What are some of the ways to future-proof enterprise architecture, taking into account disruptions caused by supply chain and other business interruptions?
I mean, you cannot predict when the supply chains and business interruptions are happening. What you can do is plan for them, right? So in order to do that, you need to create your architectures that are flexible and adaptable. Now, obviously, that's easier said than done. And when you look across the whole enterprise, you need to take into account various levers that you need to pull in order to attain that. But you need to keep a close eye on those two aspects, like make sure your architecture are flexible and make sure you can make adjustments on the fly. And another point that I want to make here, it's also stay close to the business, right? So democratize lots of the decisions making, and best bring the business together with technology together to kind of brainstorm through some of these disruptions. Because when a disruption happens, it's not necessarily only an IT problem, it's a business problem that we need to solve together.
I think just to add to what Bogdan said, I think this is a huge data game, right? So we can have the best architectures in the world, but when you have a supply chain issue where one of your raw material vendors is going out of business or is unable to send you product in a timely fashion, I think it's important, especially for large global companies and even for smaller ones where you have multiple plants. Do we have enough visibility into the raw material, into the supplies, into what's going on in each of these factories? And is that visibility readily available to the planners, right? So be it demand planners, supply planners, do they have that availability, to be able to say, hey, I'm running out of these types of fasteners, but the fastener may really, there might be 5 different SKUs of the same fastener, and another department or another factory has a different SKU of the same. And here I have a customer order that might be much more of kind of importance to the company. Can I start to get pieces from there? So the master data management becomes critical. The ability to look at your parts, the overall supply chain, where all the vendors are, where might be some product that's sitting there. I think building those types of views, building those types of analytics is important. And that would be like a step over what you're typically architecting as you look at your core, operating systems, if you will, right? The systems that come together to provide the various business capabilities. So it's a huge data play. I mean, I find that, and I've got a couple examples where we did exactly that. We found out, during the pandemic that all of a sudden something that was, 2 weeks of a turnaround time was now, 42 weeks. And what do we do in those cases? So we had to kind of reach out to the network, make it easy for our planners to be able to do searches right across of the enterprise to find similar. I mean, AI became a pretty important element there, right? Could we look at the different, part IDs, part numbers, even graphics, pictures of parts to see if something similar exists? And I think building those types of capabilities into the systems that we architect will make it more resilient and leverage the power of the data that we already have.
Great point. Agree with everything you guys said. We really have to think about both the macro as well as the microeconomic factor, right? And then the dimension of the geopolitical environment. All of this has to really come together, and the way we could do that is having the right data architecture in place, right? And a lot of this is external information, so having built that architecture where you could quickly bring these external information through APIs or what have you, and marry it with your internal data to drive decisions and quickly pivot, right? That's the power of a true enterprise architecture. To the point made earlier is how quickly can we pivot, and how quickly can we add value and drive decisions to the businesses is where the rubber would meet the road. The other example would be logistics, on a similar basis, right? Raw material logistics for us, rail cars, and we ship our chemicals through various mechanisms. And weather is so unpredictable, and it could disrupt our supply chain completely as well. So we got to make sure that with that internal and external data, you have the right architecture in place to make it much more resilient.
Okay. Any other comments on that question? Let's move on to the next. How have you seen companies build or improve API-centric architectures?
I guess I can go first. So APIs have been around for a while, right? It's all a function of reusability. I think the important thing is how much. So as you look at your overall kind of design, development, and implementation of new technology capabilities, how do you define upfront what are reusable or shareable aspects of the functions or of the capabilities that you're building? And as you define that, again, that's where I think enterprise architecture and other streams of architecture play a big role in being able to tease that type of a requirement out. So, earlier, before kind of the current incarnation of API, we talked extensively about web services, right? Web services were really, how can we take business functions and service enable them, right? There are specific business functions, and so architects would look at, what is the degree of granularity that we are going to in terms of a business service, right? So if you're doing a customer lookup, for example, or a part lookup, those could be each of those could be your individual web services. So you take the same thing into the API world as well. Again, if you have a customer lookup, right? If the architects are building the right APIs upfront and putting them in the design documents, and then when the API gets built, it gets registered into your API portal or what have you. So the next time around, when you have a similar requirement from a different function, you have those APIs out there. That becomes supremely helpful and beneficial to the broader community. So, EA certainly can help enforce some of the ground rules, the guidelines, and the guardrails on when you would use APIs and what. But I think what's more important is making sure that every API that gets created is actually available for consumption through portals, so we know what's out there, right? So people had these web services registries. Now we have API registries. Some companies I've seen keep those in Excel spreadsheets, but most of the API management platforms now do provide, the out-of-the-box inventory, if you will, that you can use, and then you can use a bunch of open source, products out there to test these APIs out as well. And I think that's the type of governance, and that's the type of, kind of process elements that have to be baked into the architecture of new requests that are being built in. The other piece I think that's also important is we have to turn back around and also look at usage metrics, right? So we can create all the APIs we want, but if they're not getting used, they're just sitting there, just consuming resources, consuming licensing, and what have you. And I think that's another element where enterprise architecture can play an important role, because time and time again, what I found is we end up in these sprints of rationalization, right? We'll do application rationalization. We end up doing, people who build power apps, you'll have like 500 power apps, and all of a sudden that becomes a problem in your rationalization. I think APIs are in the same world, right? People will build APIs. They might be very irrelevant for a certain amount of time, and then they just dry up. So I think enterprise architects and architects in general should also be looking at the usage attributes and retire those APIs, free up licenses, and kind of make it more easier for people to consume, because they don't have to then sort through 10 APIs out of which only one is used and the 9 are just sitting dormant. So that's another element that I think we strongly need in organizations that are pivoting rapidly into the digital and the API centric world.
I think additionally, what I will add to everything Kamal said is it's very important for the enterprise architecture organization to help the functional process owners understand the meaning of these technology terms and where the power of that is, right? So I'm a firm believer that enterprise architecture is that change agent within the organization. And one of the biggest skill set that I look for in my team is the art of storytelling. It's very important, right? And the storytelling has to be very non-technical, right? So coming back to this example of API, the same thing would apply. Is how can we prioritize? To everything Kamal said, I think it's also important to prioritize what API should we focus on first.
Yep.
Right? And that has to go back to what are the business priorities, what are some of the challenges that the firm has had over the past 3-5 years. I think pandemic has given us a lot of examples to explore and prioritize them, and continuously monitor the usage of it and promote the usage of it, right? By telling that story in a very non-technical term, because that's we will lose the functional process owners or the functional leads or the business liaisons the moment we start using technology jargons. So that's a very important aspect of the EA organization, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, what I've seen for companies that have been successful at adopting an API-centric architecture is they start with an API-first approach, right? So they put the APIs at the center of all the products instead of being a separate side product, right? It's not I have a website, oh, and by the way, I can expose an API that also gives you this data on the side. The API should be the core of the product, and yeah, it's going to feed into that website, and it's going to also feed in some automation or whatever it feeds down the road. But in my experience, I found that if you start with an API first approach and you design your products around APIs, that gives you the highest probability of success. Other than that, obviously, you need to think on how to create powerful APIs, and to echo Vikas and Kamal, you need to make sure they are scalable. You need to make sure they are safe and secure. They are developer and business friendly, that they can reuse them. They are plug and play to some degree, so you can reuse them across multiple elements. And very important, they need to be organized and documented via Excel spreadsheet is not optimum, but it's a start. If you have a system of record where you can take an inventory of API, that's going to be way easier for adoption and also for maintainability into the future.
And not beating the dead horse here on API, but it's a little bit dated, but APIs are a huge mechanism to generate revenues, additional revenues, right? It's a new business, it's a new channel. And an example that I always give to my business folks is, look at eBay. 90% of eBay's revenue are coming through APIs. It's not through the front end that we were used to so many years ago, right? It's a stale example, but there are many such examples that they will relate to, right? So these are mechanisms to trigger conversations with the P&L leaders on how technology has advanced and can really help.
I'm going to jump to our next question. What's next in terms of innovative EA management tools and processes?
I think I can go first. So, I've seen over the last, I'd say, 10 years or so, I mean, or maybe more actually. I think EA has peaks and troughs, right? So there was a while where kind of business focused EA and outside in and inside out and outside out, all those types of views, and then somehow kind of EA went away, and now it's coming back, and I think it's coming back with a bang, because what the last 2 or 3 years have shown us is there is merit to looking at a lot of decisions up front, right? Mapping the business and the technology pieces together. In fact, I think the lines are blurring between business and technology, right? Most of the CIOs are now, considered business leaders. I think Vikas's earlier point around API monetization, that's just a very interesting element in that how IT can actually drive revenue opportunities, right? Building these APIs appropriately, leading some of those conversations, and then creating products that could drive revenue for companies is very beneficial. So as I look at over the years, and I've been doing EA for about 20 years, give or take. At one point it was completely strategic, then somewhere in the middle it became extremely technical, and now it's back to a mix. But I'm seeing that there's a lot more focus on the business capability mapping element, right? So do we we get with the businesses and make sure we clearly document and define what that value stream map, what that business capability model is that our businesses support. Because what we find is, and again, I mean, Eaton is a good example. We have many different products, right? We build transmissions for trucks, we build circuit breakers, we build connected UPSs, we do a lot of kind of diverse product portfolio. But when you start looking at the capabilities, I'd offer that a good chunk, a majority of the capabilities are actually very similar, right? The differentiation is in the attribution, right? And what are the attributes of a product, and how are you managing the product, and so on and so forth. So the business capability aspect is super important, and therefore what I'm finding is there's a lot more companies and tools that are coming up that help you very quickly put together business capability maps. They help you put together maturity models for certain areas. I mean, as a lot of manufacturers start looking at industry 4.0 and smart factory and and the digital twin, there's a fair level of pre-packaged capability maps that's already available, that you could use to start to align with how work gets done into your company. The other thing that I'm seeing is that as we look at more and more of the technology portfolio, right, how the technology maps to those capabilities, that's also becoming more and more apparent. Because when we start looking at high availability, when we start looking at do we know what a specific deployment might impact, right? As we look at moving to the cloud, enabling DevSecOps, I think it becomes very critical for us to be able to say that if I have an API, or if I have a certain server that needs to be, there needs to be some change management done on top of the server, how does that impact which businesses? So only those businesses are now developing the plans to be able to, either it's an outage or at least inform their customers about something that might happen as a result of it. So there are also now some platforms that are beginning to create portfolio review, or again capability view type of tools on top of their other kind of service management type capabilities that they already have. So it's a fair amount of I guess enhancement. There are some very niche tools that are going out there, and then there are these platform plays that are coming in that stitch all the views together. So your application names to your server names to your APIs to even which domains they're running in, what IP networks they're running in, and how it all maps back to, at the end of the day, that business capability. And I think those are all very valuable tools, for EA to be able to use. The last thing I'd say is that more and more the tools are also becoming integratable, right? So they want you to not have to go recreate the wheel. They want to be able to ingest, your core service management data or your core CMDB data into these EA tools, and then be able to visualize on top of it, right? I've seen some views where, for example, you'll have a map of the world, and on the map of the world you show the endpoints by country. And for the global companies, it's very useful to be able to see those types of views. You can see all of your data centers and how many devices are there. On those maps, you could look at your tech debt, for example. You could look at your patch compliance. You can look at your vulnerabilities, and those things allow you to prioritize what are some of those areas that you really want to focus on. Because a lot of times, as companies have evolved, as companies have grown through acquisition, you don't have that data readily available. But again, these tools are now bringing it all together for us to make more compelling and meaningful decisions on what to do. So those are just kind of a few of my experiences, and I'll shut up.
Let's go ahead and move into Q&A. We got a number of questions, and I want to make sure we get a few of these addressed. One question is, are there any references or best practice approach related to stakeholder engagement? Any recommendations around that?
I can jump in. I think it's the storytelling of how enterprise architecture really helps with the business goal, right? So do not start with technology. Always start first, understand what is your company goal, what is your business goal, and then let's start talking their language. And technology you can always introduce to the last, right? That is, that has been one of my success mantra, in engaging business stakeholders. And then, also do things, right? There is say, but there is also do. So the say do ratio has to be really good, where you start small, show some small wins working with them, and get their confidence, and things will get going.
Yeah, demonstrate success and do that quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And I would also add the why aspect to this. Is why are we doing this, right? Make sure you definitely understand that.
Okay. Could you speak on how risks are mitigated on the AI and cloud aspects?
I think for both AI and cloud, when you look at security, right? So we've heard this many times. I think the cloud providers spend a fair amount of their investments and their dollars on making sure those platforms are secure. So there's kind of the plumbing security of it, but I think there's also the internal reviews and making sure we've got the right classification of data, making sure that we've got the right compliance measures in place. Earlier I talked about our data archiving policies, for example, right? Again, what I found in my experience is we have data retention policies, but we're not really very good at keeping them or following them. And what ends up happening is we'll have 15 years worth of data, and we only needed 7, and that does create risk, right, for the company, because if you had a legal thing show up and you had data that was potentially incriminating beyond the legal retention, that'd be a problem. So I think those are some of those security elements. I would club that into security, where as we start to provide data into these AI models, as we start to move data into the cloud, right, we want to make sure that we're only moving those data sets that are exactly required for the use case at hand. And that is, I think, most important. I think the other element from, again, security perspective is, the need to know or the right to know, right? So we got to be very purposeful and very focused on the roles and what they can do in terms of accessing these environments and accessing the data sets that are running in those environments. Because again, time and time again, we get stuck, with having the wrong people access the data, and then we're in big trouble. And then finally, I think there are, from an EA perspective, before you start to leverage a certain AI model, for example, or before you start to leverage a certain vendor or a certain reference architecture, again, it's very important to make sure you've done the due diligence up front, right? We have to ask the right security questions of the vendors, right? How is the data being stored? What level of security do you have? Who manages your keys? I think those are all elements that you need to be asking before you start giving up your data to the AI model or giving up your data and moving them into the cloud.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of quick things. One is, define zero trust for your environment. What does that mean? That's very important. And this is where the security architecture team plays a big role, right? In the overall EA, and implement that in your EA practice. That is a must. And second is, if we do this right, we will avoid duplication of data, which also causes a big risk. So that's another aspect to keep an eye for. Yeah. And then I would say not everything needs to go into the public cloud, right? So the decisions on what needs to be in public cloud, what's in your private cloud, what's your hybrid cloud strategy, I think between the three things, I think it can help mitigate a lot of your risk. And yeah.
And I would add that you need to understand your risk. Do a risk assessment. Are you talking operational risk? Are you talking reputational risk? Because that all depends on what kind of data you have, how much data you have. So there are different ways that you can mitigate each of the risk type that you have. So you can choose to accept some of that risk if you have controls in place. But at the end of the day, you need to go through the exercise of identifying what risks you are exposed to and have a plan for them.
Yeah, in the data world, it's identifying the risks and identifying the triggers, and then you have the mitigation and contingency plans documented and understand who's on point to execute those. Last question here. Have you found issues getting architecture implemented and paid for by the business? And who holds the purse strings? So I think this is kind of related to that stakeholder engagement question. So what's the issue, or the issue of funding the EA investments?
I mean, in my experience, as long as you work very closely with the business and you identify the need, you understand the need from a customer perspective, from a business perspective, why you are doing it. I think it's a conversation, and typically you get the funding if you do a good job of aligning the project with the needs. Now, if you come and it's a pure technology-driven project, you might encounter some resistance from your accounting CFOs or whatever other business leaders you have. But as long as you align to the business strategies, align with your customer needs, I found it's easier to get budgets for your initiatives.
Yeah, and I would add, I would strongly encourage organizations to look at EA as a practice and not as an organization. The moment you start looking at it as a set of people leading this, that's when you limit the benefits of EA. It is a practice, right? The more you are able to storytell that aspect of it, it will and show incremental benefits. I think things will become easier.
And I'll just add, I think there's an element to, again, looking at some enterprise capabilities, sometimes it may just be IT that has to take the initial heavy lifting, I'd say, from a funding perspective as well. And so in one of my previous things, we call CIO initiatives, right? So for example, if you're looking at an enterprise service bus implementation, right? Typically the first business case implementation may not be able to afford it. And so you have to make sure that we've got the right sponsorship and buy-in from the CIO's office to be able to say that. And again, EA plays a big role in it, because that creates the foundation of a lot of a reference architecture. So EA has to sell that concept to the CIO, but ultimately the CIO should be able to fund that initiative. And then moving forward, right, you can show how, like, you are doing an MDM implementation, and because you have an event-based integration channel going, it's so much easier for you to now be able to share golden records of your data copies to downstream systems. So I think there's a level of CIO funding, and then there's a level of business funding. And I find that sometimes having the CIO funding model there helps a lot, because it's just easier for IT to be able to build and prove out some of these enterprise capabilities that the business might not be as familiar with or might be apprehensive of to be able to fund.
Yeah, and depending on the size of your organization, your IT organization, you probably want to. I'll give you an example. My EA organization is less than 3% of the overall IT cost, right? So, but the value that it can potentially provide is much more. So I think putting some data around this should also help tell the story.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to now turn the conversation back over to Michael.
Thank you very much, Michael, Bogdan, Vikas, and Kamal. We appreciate you being here so much. It was a wonderful panel discussion. That's all the time we have for this session. And so I want to thank everyone for joining us today for another fantastic session. Now, this session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. Everyone, thank you so much.